On the morning of August 20th, 1945, in a heavily guarded laboratory beneath the ruins of the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, 3 Japanese scientists stood before a metal box that would shatter every assumption they had held about their nation's struggle against the American fleet. The device sat innocuous and silent on a reinforced table, its dials and switches betraying nothing of the technological chasm it represented. They believed they were examining just another piece of enemy equipment, perhaps marginally more advanced than their own developments. They had no idea they were about to witness the reason why more than 3,900 young pilots had flown to their deaths without achieving the decisive victory they had been promised. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these scientists would discover over the following days would transform their understanding not just of technology, but of the entire conflict they had been fighting, and why the outcome had been inevitable long before the first special attack plane ever left the ground. Dr. Hideaki Nakamura had spent 4 years developing fire control systems for the Imperial Japanese Navy. At 42 years old, he had studied electrical engineering at Tokyo Imperial University and had been considered one of the brightest minds in Japan's military research establishment. Standing beside him was Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Watanabe, a naval aviation officer with a background in communications technology, and Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a physicist who had worked on Japan's own radar development programs since 1942. The 3 men represented the pinnacle of Japanese military science, and they had been summoned to Yokosuka with explicit orders from what remained of the Naval General Staff. The device before them was an American SCR-584 radar system, recovered intact from a facility on Okinawa during the final days of that terrible campaign. American forces had abandoned it during a tactical repositioning, and Japanese engineers had managed to transport it to the mainland before the island fell completely. The instructions were simple: determine how it worked, understand its capabilities, and report whether Japan's special attack units had any chance of success should the war continue. Nakamura approached the unit first, running his hands along its metal casing. The construction quality immediately struck him. The welds were perfect. The metal itself was of a grade that Japan could no longer produce in any quantity. The components inside, visible through an access panel, were arranged with a precision that suggested not just skilled assembly but mass production. This was not a prototype or a hand-built unit. This was something that had rolled off a production line, one of hundreds or perhaps thousands. Watanabe began photographing the external features, while Tanaka prepared his instruments for the internal examination. They worked in silence for the first hour, each man cataloging what he saw with the methodical precision of trained scientists. The laboratory around them was sparse, lit by a combination of weak electric lights and daylight filtering through high windows. The war had reduced even military research facilities to bare functionality. When they finally opened the primary housing, what they found made Nakamura's breath catch in his throat. The vacuum tubes inside were smaller and more numerous than anything Japan had produced. He counted 42 tubes in the receiver section alone, each one precisely calibrated and fitted. The magnetron, the heart of the radar system, sat in its cavity like a mechanical jewel, its construction so refined that Nakamura initially thought it might be a dummy unit, something decorative rather than functional. Then said Tanaka, his voice tight with something that might have been awe or might have been fear, "We need to test this. We need to see what it actually does." Watanabe had already been working on the power connections. The Americans used a different voltage standard, but the laboratory had variable transformers that could accommodate. Within 2 hours, they had the system connected and ready for activation. Nakamura checked the connections 3 times before he allowed power to flow into the device. The SCR-584 came alive with a hum that grew steadily into a quiet, purposeful rhythm. Lights illuminated across the control panel, each one steady and bright. The oscilloscope screen glowed green, and on it appeared a sweep line that traced a perfect circle over and over, with mechanical precision that no Japanese radar could match. "We should have a target," said Watanabe, "something to track." They opened the laboratory's roof access, and Tanaka went outside to set up a small reflecting target on a pole. something that would give the radar a return signal. When he came back inside and they activated the system's tracking mode, what appeared on the screen made all three men go quiet. The target appeared as a bright pip on the display, sharp and clear. But it was not the clarity alone that stunned them. It was the stability. Japanese radar systems produced flickering, uncertain returns that required experienced operators to interpret. This return was solid, unwavering, precise. The system locked onto the target automatically, and numbers began appearing on auxiliary displays that showed range, bearing, and elevation with a precision measured in single meters at a distance of more than 3 kilometers. Nakamura felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had seen the intelligence reports about American radar. He had read the technical assessments. None of them had come close to conveying what he was witnessing. This was not incrementally better than Japanese technology. This was not the product of slightly superior resources or somewhat more advanced research. This was an entirely different magnitude of capability. Over the next 3 days, the team worked 18-hour shifts, dissecting every aspect of the SCR-584's operation. They discovered that the system could track aircraft automatically, without human intervention. It could follow multiple targets simultaneously, something Japanese radar could barely manage, with dedicated operators watching single returns. The range was extraordinary. They calculated from the component specifications that the system could detect aircraft at distances exceeding 40 kilometers and track them precisely all the way to the target. But it was the fire control integration that truly revealed the scope of what they were examining. The SCR-584 was not just a detection system. It was designed to feed tracking data directly to anti-aircraft weapons, specifically to the American 5-inch 38 caliber guns and the proximity-fused shells those guns fired. The data link was automatic, continuous, and precise enough to place shells within meters of a moving aircraft without any human calculation. On the 4th day, Nakamura sat down to write his preliminary report. His hand shook slightly as he held the pen. He had been present at meetings where special attack tactics were discussed. He had heard the arguments about how a determined pilot, diving at high speed, could overcome any defense through sheer willpower and sacrifice. He had believed, because everyone believed, that courage and spirit could compensate for material disadvantages. Now he understood the truth, and it was worse than he could have imagined. The special attack units, the thousands of young men who had flown their aircraft into American ships, had been attempting the impossible. The SCR-584 could detect an approaching aircraft at distances where the pilot could barely see the target ship. It could track that aircraft continuously, predicting its position seconds into the future. It could direct multiple weapons to fire at that aircraft, filling the sky around it with shells that exploded automatically when they sensed an aircraft nearby. And it could do all of this faster and more accurately than any human operator could coordinate a defense. Watanabe had been conducting interviews with survivors from various naval engagements. He came to the laboratory on the 5th day with a folder full of testimony from sailors who had witnessed special attack operations. One account, from a destroyer captain who had survived the battles off Okinawa, described what the American defense looked like from the Japanese perspective. The American ships seemed to know our aircraft were coming before we could see them. Their guns would begin training on positions in the sky where nothing was visible. Then our planes would appear in exactly those positions, and the fire would begin immediately. The shells formed walls in the air. I watched 3 aircraft approach one American destroyer from different angles. The ship's guns tracked all 3, and all 3 were defeated before they could reach the target. The pilots were brave. They were skilled. It made no difference. Tanaka had been working on calculating the probability of success for a special attack mission against a ship equipped with SCR-584 radar and proximity-fused ammunition. His mathematics were conservative, assuming favorable conditions and experienced pilots. The numbers he produced made grim reading. For a single aircraft attacking a ship with this radar system and adequate ammunition, the probability of successfully reaching the target was less than 3%. For formations of aircraft, the probability decreased further because the radar could coordinate defensive fire more effectively than pilots could coordinate their attacks. For every 100 special attack sorties against American ships equipped with this technology, 97 aircraft would be defeated before reaching their targets. The actual historical record was even worse. Of the nearly 4,000 special attack missions conducted during the final year of the conflict, fewer than 19% achieved any form of contact with enemy vessels, and of those, only a fraction caused significant damage. The pilots had attributed their losses to bad luck, to overwhelming numbers of American fighters, to weather and timing. None of them had known they were flying into an invisible mathematical certainty, a defensive system so advanced that human determination could not overcome it. Nakamura's final report ran to 47 pages. He documented every aspect of the SCR-584's capabilities. He included technical schematics, performance calculations, and comparative analyses with Japanese systems. He described the magnetron's operating principles, the automatic tracking algorithms, the fire control integration, and the implications for naval combat. But it was the conclusion that he knew would be the most difficult to write and the most important. He sat alone in the laboratory on the evening of August 27th, with the radar system humming quietly behind him, and he forced himself to confront what he had learned. The special attack strategy was conceived based on fundamental misunderstandings about American defensive capabilities. Our intelligence services reported that American radar was effective but manageable. We believed that a pilot diving at high speed from unexpected angles could penetrate any defense through tactics and determination. We calculated that even with heavy losses, enough aircraft would reach their targets to justify the sacrifice. All of these beliefs were wrong. The American SCR-584 radar system, and we must assume similar systems are deployed across their fleet, represents a level of technological sophistication that renders conventional attack methods nearly ineffective. More significantly, it renders special attack methods, which rely on the aircraft reaching the target, almost completely ineffective. A pilot cannot outmaneuver a system that predicts his position faster than he can change it. A pilot cannot hide from a system that sees him from distances beyond his own vision. A pilot cannot overcome a defensive network that coordinates multiple weapons with mechanical precision. Courage, skill, and determination are irrelevant variables when confronting this technology. He paused, staring at the words he had written. In another room, he knew, Watanabe was preparing similar conclusions from the tactical perspective. Tanaka was finishing his statistical analysis. Together, their reports would tell the Naval General Staff something that no one wanted to hear: that the special attack strategy had failed, not because of insufficient commitment or poor execution, but because it had been attempting to overcome an insurmountable technological barrier. The next section of his report was perhaps the most painful. He had to explain why this technology existed, why America possessed it in such quantities, and what that revealed about the broader conflict. The SCR-584 is not an experimental device or a limited deployment. Based on its construction, components, and standardization, this is a mass-produced system. The Americans are building these in factories, hundreds or thousands at a time, and deploying them across their fleet. The implications are profound. Japan's entire industrial capacity is currently insufficient to produce even one device of this sophistication per month. We lack the refined materials, the precision manufacturing equipment, the electronic components, and the theoretical knowledge base. The gap is not something that can be closed through effort or determination. It represents years or decades of scientific and industrial development that we simply do not possess. More significantly, the existence of this technology in mass-produced form reveals that the American industrial capacity is so vast that they can build highly complex systems in quantities we cannot match even for simple weapons. They are not merely larger than our industrial base. They are operating at a fundamentally different level of productive capability. Nakamura had served his country faithfully for 20 years. He had believed in Japan's divine mission, in the superiority of spirit over material, in the destiny of the empire. Now, sitting in a basement laboratory with an American radar system humming behind him, he felt those beliefs crumbling into ash. The radar did not care about destiny. It saw only physics, mathematics, and electromagnetic returns, and in that cold calculus, courage was merely another variable to be processed and overcome. On August 29th, the three scientists presented their findings to a committee of naval officers in what remained of the Naval Ministry building in Tokyo. The city outside was a landscape of rubble and ash, still smoldering from the firebombing raids. The meeting room itself was damaged, its windows covered with boards, its walls cracked from nearby explosions. Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Miwa listened to the presentation in silence. He was 54 years old, a career naval officer who had overseen many of the special attack operations. His face revealed nothing as Nakamura described the SCR-584's capabilities, as Watanabe detailed the tactical implications, as Tanaka presented his statistical analysis of mission failure rates. When they finished, Miwa sat quietly for a long moment. Then he asked the question that Nakamura had been dreading. Could we have known? Was there any way for us to have understood this before? Nakamura chose his words carefully. The truth was painful, but it had to be spoken. The fundamental principles of the technology were known, sir. We understood that radio waves could be used for detection and tracking. We had our own radar systems. But we made critical errors in assessment. We assumed American technology was only moderately more advanced than ours. We assumed their industrial capacity had limits similar to our own. We assumed that determination and tactical innovation could overcome any material advantage. All of these assumptions were incorrect, and they led us to believe that special attack tactics could succeed. Had we truly understood what we are facing, the entire strategic framework would need to be different. You cannot overcome this technology with current methods. You cannot train pilots to evade it. You cannot develop tactics to defeat it. The only counter would be similar technology deployed in similar quantities, and we do not possess the industrial capacity to produce such things. Another officer, a captain whose name Nakamura did not catch, spoke up. His voice was tight with anger or perhaps grief. You are telling us that every pilot we sent, every young man who gave his life in special attack operations, died uselessly? That their sacrifice achieved nothing? Nakamura met his gaze directly. This was the moment he had known would come, and he would not soften the truth. I am telling you that they were sent against a defensive system that rendered their sacrifice nearly meaningless in tactical terms. Not because they lacked courage or skill, but because the technology they faced could not be overcome by human capabilities alone. They were brave, they were dedicated, they deserved to succeed. But physics and mathematics do not respect courage. The radar saw them coming, tracked them precisely, and directed weapons that defeated them before they could complete their missions. This is what the evidence shows. The room fell silent. Outside, Nakamura could hear the distant sounds of reconstruction, of people trying to salvage something from the ruins. Inside, the officers sat with the weight of what they had just learned. Vice Admiral Miwa finally spoke again, his voice carrying a weariness that seemed to age him as he talked. We told them they would succeed. We told their families they died achieving great victories. We told the nation that their sacrifice was turning the tide of battle. And all along they were flying into an invisible barrier that made their efforts futile. He looked at Nakamura with eyes that held something beyond simple defeat. It was the look of a man confronting a truth that invalidated everything he had believed and everything he had ordered others to do. Continue your analysis, Dr. Nakamura. Document everything. If we survive this war, if there is a future for our nation, we must understand exactly how and why we failed. Not for revenge, not for pride, but so that we never again send our young men to die based on comfortable illusions rather than harsh realities. Over the following weeks, Nakamura and his team expanded their analysis. They examined not just the SCR-584, but what its existence implied about American industrial and scientific capabilities. They studied the supply chains required to produce such devices in quantity, the educational systems needed to train the scientists and engineers who designed them, the manufacturing infrastructure required to build them, the logistical networks needed to deploy and maintain them. Each layer of analysis revealed another dimension of the gap between the two nations. The radar itself was remarkable, but what was more remarkable was that America could produce it in vast numbers, while simultaneously building ships, aircraft, vehicles, weapons, and all the other machinery of modern conflict. The total industrial output was so enormous that it seemed almost mythological. Yet the evidence sat before them in the form of one mass-produced radar unit. Tanaka calculated that to match American production of advanced electronics alone, Japan would need to build approximately 17 new factories of the largest size currently in operation, staff them with engineers who did not exist, and supply them with raw materials that were not available. And that was just for one category of military equipment. The gaps in other areas, shipbuilding, aircraft production, steel manufacturing, were similarly insurmountable. But it was the human dimension that haunted Nakamura most. He obtained mission reports from special attack units, reading the final letters of pilots who had believed they were making a decisive difference. They wrote about honor, about sacrifice, about how their deaths would protect their families and homeland. They had no idea that the ships they attacked could see them coming from distances they could not imagine, track them with precision they could not evade, and defeat them with weapons they could not overcome. One letter, from a 19-year-old pilot named Takeshi Kobayashi, particularly affected him. The young man had written to his mother the night before his final mission, describing his confidence that his sacrifice would be meaningful, that his aircraft would reach the target and strike a blow against the enemy. Records showed that Kobayashi's aircraft was defeated at a distance of more than 2 kilometers from his target ship, tracked and engaged by radar-directed weapons that he never saw. He died believing he was moments away from success, never knowing that success had been mathematically impossible from the moment he came within the radar's range. In mid-September, Nakamura received permission to interview one of the very few special attack pilots who had survived. Lieutenant Masao Yoshida had been part of a formation that attacked American ships off Okinawa in May. His aircraft had been damaged by defensive fire, but not destroyed. He had managed to disengage and return to base, one of the only pilots to do so from that particular operation. Yoshida was 23 years old, thin and hollow-eyed from months of combat stress. He sat across from Nakamura in a small office at the Yokosuka base, his hands folded in his lap, and answered questions in a quiet, measured voice. "What do you remember about the approach to the target?" Nakamura asked. Yoshida was silent for a moment, his eyes distant. "The Americans knew we were coming. We approached low, hoping to avoid detection, but their ships turned toward us before we were visible. Their weapons began firing while we were still distant. The shells exploded in the air around us, creating clouds of fragments. I saw 2 aircraft from my formation defeated within seconds of each other, both far from the target. I continued forward because those were my orders, but the defensive fire was so intense that I could not maintain my approach. A shell exploded near my aircraft, damaging the control surfaces. I should have continued, should have completed the mission, but the aircraft would not respond properly. I had to withdraw." "Did you feel you had any chance of reaching the target?" Nakamura asked carefully. Yoshida met his gaze, and in his eyes Nakamura saw something that might have been relief at finally being able to speak the truth. "No. The defensive fire was too precise, too concentrated. It was not random fire that you could avoid through skill. It was targeted, predictive. The shells exploded near us even when we changed course. It felt as though the ships could see our intentions before we acted on them. I did not understand how that was possible, but I knew that something was different from what we had been told to expect." Nakamura explained as gently as he could about the SCR-584 radar system. He described how it worked, what it could do, why Yoshida and his comrades had faced such precise defensive fire. The young pilot listened without expression until Nakamura finished. Then Yoshida said something that would stay with Nakamura for the rest of his life. "So we never had a chance. All those pilots, all that sacrifice, it was futile from the beginning. They sent us to die knowing we could not succeed, or they sent us to die without caring whether we could succeed. I do not know which is worse." Nakamura had no answer to give him. Both alternatives were equally damning. By October, the conflict had ended, and Nakamura's work took on a different character. The occupation authorities were interested in Japanese scientific and technical capabilities, and his expertise made him valuable for liaison work. He found himself explaining Japanese technology to American engineers, and in those conversations, he gained another perspective on the gulf between the two nations. An American radar engineer, a Major Robert Collins from Massachusetts, visited the Yokosuka laboratory to inspect the SCR-584 that Nakamura's team had been studying. Collins was 31 years old, friendly and informal, in a way that Nakamura found distinctly American. He examined the unit with professional interest, noting the condition and checking various components. "You folks did a good job keeping this intact," Collins said. "These units are pretty robust, but they can be finicky if mishandled." Nakamura asked the question that had been gnawing at him since August. "How many of these systems did you produce?" Collins thought for a moment. "I don't have exact figures, but I know we built thousands of the SCR-584 units. They were deployed on most major surface combatants by late 1944, and pretty much everything in the fleet by early 1945. We had entire factories dedicated to radar production. It was a major priority. Thousands." The word hung in the air between them. Nakamura had spent weeks analyzing one unit, and the Americans had built thousands of them while simultaneously prosecuting a global conflict on multiple fronts. Collins seemed to recognize something in Nakamura's expression. He spoke more quietly, less technically. "Look, I know this is difficult, but if it helps at all, you should know that we respected your engineers and scientists. The people who designed your equipment were working with limited resources, and they did remarkable things. Your Type 2 radar was actually pretty clever in its approach. The problem was never talent or intelligence. It was resources and time. You were trying to catch up to something that had a huge head start and unlimited backing." Nakamura appreciated the sentiment, but it did not change the fundamental reality. Thousands of young men had died because of the gap Collins was describing as a matter of resources and time. Each of those men had a name, a family, a life that ended in fire and steel, because the nation that sent them to war had not understood what they would face. In November, Nakamura wrote a final comprehensive report on his findings. It was more than a technical document. It was an attempt to explain how a nation could misjudge so completely the capabilities it was confronting and the costs of that misjudgment. He wrote about the tendency to see enemies through the lens of one's own capabilities, assuming they faced similar limitations and constraints. He wrote about how cultural factors, the belief in spiritual superiority, the conviction that determination mattered more than material, had blinded leadership to technological realities. He wrote about how intelligence failures, both in gathering information and in analyzing what information was available, had led to catastrophically incorrect assessments. But mostly he wrote about responsibility. Someone had to acknowledge that every pilot sent on a special attack mission had been sent based on false assumptions and incomplete understanding. Someone had to document that those men died, not because they failed, but because they had been asked to accomplish something that was technically impossible with the resources and technology available to them. The report was read by few people and changed nothing in any practical sense. The conflict was over. The special attack units were disbanded. The young men were dead. But Nakamura believed, had to believe, that there was value in documenting the truth even when it could not change outcomes. Years later, after he had rebuilt a career in civilian electronics research, Nakamura occasionally lectured to engineering students. He would sometimes talk about his wartime work, and inevitably a student would ask about the special attack operations. Nakamura would describe the SCR-584 radar system, explain its capabilities, and detail why the tactics employed against it had been doomed to fail. Then he would say something that he hoped his students would remember. Technology is not neutral. It embodies the resources, knowledge, industrial capacity, and scientific sophistication of the society that creates it. When there is a large gap in these factors between opposing forces, courage and determination cannot bridge that gap. This does not diminish the courage or determination. It simply means that they are insufficient against certain types of material advantage. Understanding this, truly understanding it, might prevent future generations from being sent to attempt the impossible while being told they are attempting the merely difficult. In the decades after the conflict, the story of the special attack units became mythologized in various ways. Some accounts focused on the heroism and sacrifice, which were real and deserved recognition. Others focused on the tragedy of young lives lost, which was equally real and equally important. But few accounts addressed the fundamental technical reality that Nakamura had discovered in that basement laboratory in August 1945, that the pilots had been sent against a defensive system they had no realistic means of overcoming. The SCR-584 radar system that Nakamura studied remained in the Yokosuka laboratory for several years after the conflict ended. It sat there inert and silent, a monument to the technological gap that had made so much sacrifice meaningless. Eventually, it was shipped to a museum, where it exists today as a historical artifact. Visitors walk past it without understanding what it represents, without knowing that this particular type of metal box, multiplied by thousands and deployed across a fleet, had created an invisible barrier that courage alone could not cross. Nakamura died in 1987 at the age of 84. In his final years, he gave several interviews about his wartime work. In one of these interviews, conducted by a historian researching the special attack operations, he was asked if there was anything he would want people to understand about what he had learned in that Yokosuka laboratory in 1945. He thought for a long moment before answering. I would want people to understand that those young pilots were not defeated by any lack of courage or skill or determination. They were defeated by mathematics, by physics, by an industrial and technological capability gap so large that individual heroism became irrelevant. This is not a comfortable truth, because we want to believe that courage matters more than technology, that spirit can overcome material disadvantage. But the radar did not care about courage. It saw only targets, calculated trajectories, and directed weapons. The pilots never had a chance. And the tragedy is that they died without knowing this, believing until the end that their sacrifice would make a difference. The interviewer asked one final question. Did your work, examining that radar system and understanding what it meant, did it change how you thought about the conflict or about your own role in it? Nakamura's answer was simple and devastating. It taught me that good people can serve terrible policies when they do not understand the full truth of what they are serving. I helped develop fire control systems. I believed I was helping my country. I did not understand until too late that what my country needed was not better weapons, but better understanding of what we actually faced. By the time I examined that American radar system, it was too late for that understanding to save anyone. But I have spent the rest of my life trying to ensure that future generations understand that courage without understanding, sacrifice without accurate assessment, honor without technical reality, these things do not lead to victory. They lead only to tragedy. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.